After the German victories on the spring of 1940, America's relations with Japan took a turn for the worse. September 27th, 1940, as we've seen in the previous video, Tokyo signed a tripartite agreement with Germany and Italy, by which they pledged to declare war on any nation that attacked any of them. The Germans hoped to persuade Japan, and the whole purpose of Hitler entering this pact with Japan was to persuade Japan to enter the war against Russia. In fact, this would prove yet to be another one of Hitler's blunders, in that Japan won't declare war against Russia. In fact, quite the opposite. Russia, the Soviet Union, and Japan will sign a non-aggression pact on April 13th, 1941. And so the two won't go to war against each other. Well, at least until 1945. Kind of getting ahead of the story, in 1945, as the war is winding down, August of 1945, at the very end, one of the events that leads to American hard feelings toward the Soviet Union is that in the last moments of the war, the Soviet Union declares war on Japan in order to get the goodies that the United States promised. But for the bulk of the war, the Soviet Union and Japan are going to be at peace with one another. Now it's a tentative peace, and they're a guarded peace. But nonetheless, Japan doesn't do what Adolf Hitler wanted, which is to open up a second front against the Soviet Union to pull troops from the east from the west to the east. In July of 1941, Japan announced that it was assuming a protectorate over all of French Indochina, all of the areas as France capitulates to Germany in the Blitzkrieg. All of France's overseas holdings, while technically still under the control of Vichy France, France can't exercise their authority over those areas, and so Japan announces a protectorate, that they're going to watch over those French territories while France is indisposed, if you will. Franklin Roosevelt responds to Japan's announcement of a protectorate by freezing Japanese assets in the United States, which cut off Japan's money supply, it cut off Japan's line of credit, it ended their ability to buy certain items within the United States. Which then, of course, in retaliation, forced Japan to secure oil supplies elsewhere, to secure iron supplies elsewhere. And so the Japanese Army and Navy began planning attacks on the Dutch and British colonies in Southeast Asia. They control France's, now they want the rest of it. And of course, one of those obstacles to Japanese expansion is the Philippines and other areas under American control in the Pacific. Secretary of State Cordell Hull insisted that Japan withdraw from Indochina and China before the United States would resume full trade. This aggravated an already divided Japanese government. The Peace Party was led by Prince Fumimaro Konoe, and the War Party was led by the War Minister Hideaki Tojo. And Konoe and Tojo are in an ongoing feud and rivalry to control the government. Konoe, while he is a moderate militarist, he supports the Japanese intentions in China and in Indochina. He doesn't want a direct attack on the United States. He seeks peace with the United States by whatever means are necessary. And so he is put at a disadvantage by Roosevelt's insistence that complete withdrawal from Indochina and China are necessary before any full trade relations are reestablished. And it undercuts the person who would be an American ally, Konoe, while supporting the person who wants war with the United States, Hideaki Tojo. To say that Japan misjudged American reaction is an understatement. The Japanese believed that the isolationists in the United States wouldn't allow the U.S. to intervene on behalf of the British or Dutch colonies. The Japanese, especially under Tojo, determined that they dare not leave the American Navy intact and the Philippines untouched, with them on the flank of Japanese advancement into the British or Dutch Indies. And so the real issue at heart is whether the United States would become involved in the conflict for the Dutch colonies and the British colonies or not. In August of 1941, Prime Minister Konoe proposed a personal meeting with Franklin Roosevelt, wanting to meet and discuss the issues outstanding. Secretary of State Hull advised that no meeting could take place between the two unless there was a fundamental agreement on issues in advance. Now, this has led some to hypothesize that there might have been members of Roosevelt's cabinet, if not Roosevelt himself, who were pushing toward war. With the tripartite pact in effect, war with Japan would bring war with Germany and Italy, and that had seemed to be the goal of the Atlantic Charter, which is being signed at this same time. On September 6th, the Japanese Imperial Conference in Tokyo approved preparations for a surprise attack on Hawaii and gave Prime Minister Konoe 6 weeks to reach a resolution with the United States before an attack was launched. If Konoe didn't reach an agreement, then war would happen. Now, the Japanese Emperor Hirohito, was displeased at the idea of an attack, and he gave Konoe one last chance at compromise. However, it would be China that's the stumbling block. In October of 1941, Konoe urged War Minister Hedekai Tojo to consider withdrawing from China to give Konoe a bargaining chip with the United States. Give him something, some type of troop withdrawal. It didn't have to be a massive troop withdrawal, but some face-saving gesture to pull back and allow Japan, Konoe specifically, the luxury of saying, see, we are reacting and we can't quit the war overnight, but at least meet with us because we're acting in good faith. Tojo responded to Konoe with his maximum concession that Japanese troops would stay in China no longer than 25 years if the United States stopped aiding China immediately. And so out of protest, Prime Minister Konoe will resign on October 15th, and Hedekai Tojo became Prime Minister of Japan. And at that point, war with the United States was inevitable. The war party completely controlled the government. Japanese pilots and carriers had already been training for a possible attack on Pearl Harbor and on the Pacific Fleet. And so from October to December, all Japanese negotiations with the United States are pure camouflage for the coming attack. You see in the slide, you see the picture of how the Japanese government, especially under the War Minister Tojo, views FDR. He's the Frankenstein fixture, or he's the werewolf picture. That he's the boogeyman coming to get Japan. That's how he's portrayed. And then, of course, Japan's real nightmare isn't FDR, it's the Pacific Battle Fleet. Remember back in 1907 and 1908 when Theodore Roosevelt sent the battleship fleet on the round-the-world cruise. That was firmly implanted in the minds of Japanese school children who are now the leaders of Japan as we gear up for war. Those leaders remember that battleship fleet. They remember that awesome display, and they fear it. While at the same time, they're preparing to destroy it with the new queen of the seas, the aircraft carrier. Preparing the attack on the United States was given to Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Yamamoto, who had studied in the United States, who knew American war tactics, who had studied at the War College, was familiar with the United States, had a number of friends in the United States. He had advised against the attack. Now, he's a good follower of the emperor, and he's going to do his duty, but he advises the government against this attack. His famous quote that in attacking the United States, you're going to awaken a sleeping giant, proved to be prophetic. And then Yamamoto relies on his chief advisor and planner, Captain Minoru Genda, to prepare the details of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Washington officials knew that an attack was imminent. They knew that the Japanese carrier fleet had disappeared. They were training in the northern Japanese islands away from prying eyes, and also at a location that they could slip off into the Pacific and not be accounted for a number of days with no real danger of it getting back to the United States. So while the Japanese negotiate, even to the very moments of the attack, the Japanese were negotiating with the United States. Washington officials knew that an attack was coming. The question was where. Modern historians usually laughed at in historical circles, but modern scholars have done everything they can to provide cover for Franklin Roosevelt, that Roosevelt had no clue where the attack was coming. He certainly didn't think it would be Pearl Harbor, whether it was bias against the Japanese, that they were incapable of such a monumental attack, whether it was pride and arrogance that the United States would never be caught sleeping like that. Most military planners anticipated an attack in the Philippines. They anticipated an attack on British and Dutch possessions, but there was little regard given to an attack on Pearl Harbor itself. And even then, a comedy of errors would delay a war warning from being delivered in time to meet the attack. 6 Japanese carriers slip away into the Pacific, led by Admiral Nagumo. Those 6 carriers that you see on the slide, illustrated by their Japanese name and then what that name means. Having some of the best pilots and best planes and equipment of the day. Certainly the Japanese aircraft carrier fleet was superior to anything that the United States had, at least briefly. Their planes and pilots were better trained and better prepared than anything that the United States had. And the attack is going to come as a complete surprise. That attack is predicated by submarines, midget subs launched from large fleet submarines, and you can see the midget sub on the slide. These midget subs were often carried on the back of large fleet subs and launched. Many of these midget subs tried to penetrate Pearl Harbor defenses. In fact, one did. Others tried to destroy screening vessels and escort vessels outside of Pearl Harbor, but they were a precursor to the attack. And then the waves of planes launched from the carrier. There will be 3 waves planned, a third in reserve, 2 attacks carried out. And you can see the planes on the slide, the number of planes. Now you're going to find different sources disagree on this, but this serves as a good guideline, if you will, for the first wave. Led by Commander Mutsu Fushida, who you'll see on the next slide. I had to put it on the next slide due to space requirements. On December 7th, 1941, at 7:53 a.m., the command Tora, 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 or Tiger, 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 was given to launch the attack. The first wave led by Mutsu Fushida. The second wave, Shigatsu Shimazaki, will lead the second wave, and you can see the Shigatsu Shimazaki is going to lead the second wave, an attack on Pearl Harbor. And you can see from the map how the first and second waves approached the island and the naval base itself. Having been to this naval base, and most students in class when we talk about Pearl Harbor are overwhelmed by the sheer size of Pearl Harbor. Not that it's so big, but that it's so small. It's amazingly small, and you wonder how they could cram that many ships. The picture on the right shows the breakdown of the harbor and where the various ships were located, especially Battleship Row, and how they were disposed around Ford Island in the middle of the harbor. But it seems impossible that many ships could be crammed in that harbor. It also seems impossible when you look at it that the Japanese would be able to launch a torpedo assault. You see, a torpedo, and if you look at the plane in the middle, the torpedo bomber, you see that the torpedo is almost half of the length of the plane, and it weighed in excess of almost 1,000 pounds. It's incredibly heavy. And that torpedo, when you drop it from an airplane, just like you drop anything in water, what happens? Well, it goes under the water. Well, a torpedo is designed when a plane is progressing toward a target and it drops that torpedo, the torpedo falls from the plane, enters the water, and it dives to a depth, sometimes 50, 60 feet down, and then it comes back up. It porpoises up to a cruising depth of about 4 to 6 feet, sometimes a little deeper, depending on how it's set. Well, it was determined by American authorities that Pearl Harbor was simply too shallow for a torpedo attack. And so while the ships are arrayed to prevent that type of attack, none of them had their anti-torpedo netting out, and it was believed that no attack was a real danger to those ships because the torpedoes would get stuck in the bottom of Pearl Harbor. In fact, every few years, torpedoes dug up out of the harbor. Then, in fact, they did. But the Japanese solved the torpedo problem with a very ingenious device: wooden fins. They put these wooden fins on the torpedo, so when the torpedo dropped from the plane and hit the water, it would only go so deep, and the fins would take the current and come up, and so it would only dive a third of the depth of a normally dropped torpedo without the fins. And then the fins would break away, slowing it down, so they would break away, and then the torpedo would travel toward its target. And so you see the opening moments of the attack as the first explosion occurs on Battleship Row. You see a colorized version, and then on both of these pictures are taken on the left are taken by Japanese photographers. I think the rear photographer riding with Mutsu Fushida took the pictures of the initial torpedoes, and then you see the anti-aircraft fire over Battleship Row, but because of all the smoke, you can tell that's much later in the attack. But the target are those battleships lined up in that nice row. The commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet at the time of the attack was Admiral Husband Kimmel. He will be considered responsible for the debacle at Pearl Harbor because of his failure to take necessary measures in light of the heightened conditions. but he in many instances is taken as a scapegoat for the American failure at Pearl Harbor. In the initial stages of the attack, the focus, of course, is on not only Battleship Row, but on the aircraft at the airfields. And so you see a picture on the upper left there of a Japanese plane flying over the American airfield. It's just dropped its bomb, and you can see the plane flying over, and then the results of that attack. Most of the American aircraft were destroyed on the ground and never were able to get in the air to provide defense. The attacks on Battleship Row and around Pearl Harbor, you see the explosion of the USS Shaw and the wreckage of the Cassin and Downs in front of the battleship Pennsylvania that were in dry dock. Incredible destruction and loss of life. 2,400 American servicemen and civilians would be killed. I'll have a more specific figure for you a little later. But the attack was more successful than the Japanese wildest dreams. Now, there were some American defenders that got airborne, flying the Curtiss P-36 Hawk on the left or the Warhawk on the right. The few flyers, so against the hundreds the Japanese are putting in the air, there's 6 planes that get airborne and provide some defense. But for the most part, Battleship Row, Pearl Harbor, and the airfields around the islands were totally defenseless. And so you see the breakdown of 2,402 Army, Navy, and Marines that were killed, another 1,282 wounded, 68 civilians killed, 35 wounded, 400 of the planes available, 188 destroyed, 159 damaged, and then 2 battleships totally destroyed, 6 battleships damaged, a training ship, an ex-battleship, the Utah, destroyed, and 8 other ships severely damaged. On the Japanese side, in the conflict, there were 55 airmen killed and 9 submariners, and 1 submariner captured. And these are from the midget subs, so there were not extensive crews in them. Of the 414 planes available, 29 were shot down or crashed, 9 in Wave 1, 20 in Wave 2, and 74 were damaged but returned back to their carriers. This is important because this makes the decision for the Japanese commanders as to whether to launch a third wave. What you see in Wave 1 to Wave 2 is a doubling of the number of planes shot down and then a considerable increase in the planes damaged. As the Americans recover from the initial shock and as the attacks wear on, their anti-aircraft is becoming more effective against Japanese planes. More and more planes are making it into the air to fight off the Japanese attackers, and more ships are getting out to sea. The simple fact is the Japanese know that they did not accomplish their main objective, which we'll talk about in a minute, and they're afraid of what might happen. They're afraid that if yet you have a doubling again in casualties, so we went from 9 to 20, so if you have a Wave 3 and you have 40 more planes shot down, you're getting to substantial numbers. And the Japanese are needing those planes for future battles and to protect their carriers on the way home. So they make a decision to withdraw. And then you see, of course, 5 midget subs sunk or captured. The plane you see, by the way, to the left there, is a damaged plane that one of the far out Japanese islands was considered a rescue point, that planes that were too damaged to return to the carrier could make a crash landing, and the pilot was captured and beaten by the Hawaiians and held until the proper authorities could get there. But he made it to the rendezvous point. They just never picked him up, and he was held by the Hawaiians until the authorities could pick him up. Now, Any way you look at it, Pearl Harbor was an overwhelming success for the Japanese. But I'm going to give you 8 ways that Pearl Harbor could have been a decisive victory, maybe even a knockout blow for the Japanese if they had accomplished these things. So while Pearl Harbor is undeniably a success, Japan pulled off the battle of the century in its surprise, in its execution. Any of these things had changed, Japan's victory would have been even greater and would have prevented the United States from making a quick recovery from the loss. So, first off, the Japanese failed to sink the American aircraft carriers. The United States had 3 aircraft carriers in the Pacific. They had the USS Enterprise, and they had the USS Lexington. And you can see where, in relation to the Hawaiian Islands, where they had gone and they were out at sea. So when the Japanese hit the Hawaiian Islands, the aircraft carriers are nowhere to be found. They were ferrying fighter planes to remote islands, or they were out on maneuvers. But either way, the 2 primary targets, the Enterprise and the Lexington, simply were not in port. So while the Navy takes a huge blow, those aircraft carriers are still available to strike back. So you have the Enterprise, you have the Lexington, and then the 3rd aircraft carrier in the Pacific was the Saratoga. The Saratoga was undergoing refit in Puget Sound, Washington, and wasn't available for Pacific duty for a while. So you have 3 carriers, all intact, all that will return to service fairly quickly. And so the Japanese failures to take out the aircraft carriers are a monumental problem. Second, the U.S. Navy is incredibly tradition-bound. And the fight throughout the 1930s, the Navy had fought so hard to get a modern fleet. They had fought so hard to follow Mahan's doctrines that we seemingly have talked about all semester, to get this fleet up to a world-class standard, and a fleet that could take on anybody. The supremacy of our battleship fleet was unchallenged. But there was this small element within the Navy that said, you know, the day of the battleship is come and gone. The aircraft carrier is the queen of the seas now. The battleship is a support vessel. And while the Navy argued over whether the aircraft carrier or the battleship should be supreme and whether the fleet should be based around the assault capabilities of the battleship or the long-range strike capabilities of the aircraft carrier, this fight tended to tear apart the Navy. Here you have the Japanese, once and for all, ending the question as all 8 battleships on Battleship Row burn, sink, are disabled, are destroyed. Whether it be the Oklahoma rolled upside down, the California about to sink in place, the Arizona that takes a bomb down the deck into the ammunition locker. It's now been proven by modern forensics and modern analysis of both the audio recording of the explosion of the Arizona and the video and pictures that survive of the attack on the Arizona, that what was once believed that a bomb had gone down the funnel of the Arizona and exploded in the engine room simply isn't so. A bomb penetrated the deck of the Arizona and exploded in the ammunition locker, and that exploded the main. Exploded the Arizona, destroying it completely. And so you see Battleship Row on fire and destroyed, and no longer will the battleship be supreme. Now, the battleship is a fine tool, mind you, and nothing reaches out and touches an opponent, especially an opponent without a navy, like a battleship. But in World War II, it is the aircraft, and it is the aircraft carrier that comes to dominate. And the Japanese answered that question for the Navy once and for all. Third, the Japanese were so focused on the aircraft carriers that weren't at Pearl Harbor and the battleships that were at Pearl Harbor that they didn't attack the submarines. Now, the submarines tied up along the long pier you see in the top right picture, and then elsewhere around the harbor tied up to submarine tenders. These submarines that were ignored or were in fact charted for that third wave that didn't happen, it would be those submarines that for the first year to 2 years of the war take the war to the Japanese. Long before the U.S. fleet's in a position to respond and begin pushing back, it's the submarine that travels the Pacific, heads into Japanese waters, and makes Japanese shipping a nightmare. It will be American submariners that go into enemy waters and with inadequate torpedoes will time and time and time again take the war to the enemy. Now, there was a mechanical malfunction in American torpedoes that made American torpedoes run erratically. Submariners would, reports came back in the first year of the war, time and time again, of a submarine maneuvering into position, taking hours to get into position for an attack on an enemy ship, firing a spread of torpedoes, usually 2 to 3 torpedoes at a unsuspecting ship, and having a number of things happen. A torpedo porpoising out of the water and giving away that an attack was imminent, or a premature detonation, or a torpedo reaching its target, but the depth settings which had been set on the submarine for a shallow torpedo, the torpedo dives under the ship, totally missing the target and exploding on the far side. Or the torpedo hitting the side of the ship and not exploding. Or probably the worst, the torpedo fired from the submarine and the gyroscope malfunctioning, the torpedo goes in a 360 turn, comes in a full circle, and blows up the submarine that fired it. So American submarines will take the war to the Japanese for the duration of the war, but especially those 2 years while the fleet recovers. It's the submarine that is the punch of the U.S. Navy. Fourth, the Japanese, in lieu of destroying the aircraft carriers, wanted to make Pearl Harbor non-functional. They wanted to sink a large capital ship in the harbor entrance, making the harbor useless. So even if the aircraft carriers got home, there's no way that they could resupply at Pearl Harbor. They would have to go to the West Coast, and therefore leaving Pearl Harbor exposed. But the Japanese simply failed to block the harbor. Only one, you might even say they're a victim of their own success. Out of all of the battleships on Battleship Row, only one battleship, the USS Nevada, gets underway. Now, as the Japanese are circling Pearl Harbor, as the commanders are watching, they see the Nevada get underway, and as it builds up steam and heads toward the entrance, they began ordering more and more craft to target the Nevada. So as the Nevada defends itself, the captain of the Nevada realizes that the pace of attack has picked up and that his ship is now the target of the attack. Realizing what the Japanese were trying to do, the captain of the Nevada purposefully runs the Nevada aground off of Hospital Point, which does a number of things. First, you can't block the harbor if it's already run aground out of the channel. Secondly, it makes the Nevada, you can't sink a ship that's already run aground. Third, it's now instead of a moving ship that's trying to hit aircraft, it's now a stable gun platform that increasingly is able to pick off the attackers. And so you see pictures of during and shortly after the attack, cruisers that weren't targeted by the attack able to make their way out of Pearl Harbor to join the outside collection of vessels that are then going to pursue the Japanese. Won't catch them, thankfully for them, won't catch them, but will then be in a position to defend Pearl Harbor from a potential invasion. So the Japanese failed in blocking Pearl Harbor. A fifth failure of the Japanese was they failed to destroy the oil facilities surrounding the harbor. The arrows point to just 2 large tank farms, as they are called, but huge oil storage facilities that provided the fuel for the fleet to run. It's estimated that at the attack on Pearl Harbor, those oil storage vessels contained 140 million gallons of oil. Those oil storage facilities were on that third wave of attack that never comes. And as Chester Nimitz is going to replace Kimmel as Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. By the way, he's a Texan, born and raised in Fredericksburg, Texas. If you ever get a chance to go to Fredericksburg, the Nimitz Museum is there. The Museum of the Pacific Theater is in Texas, not Hawaii, not anywhere it's in Texas. And one of the only Japanese peace gardens maintained by the Japanese government is in Fredericksburg as an honor to Chester Nimitz. But as Nimitz would later say, and I have his quote on the slide, had the Japanese destroyed the oil, it would have prolonged the war by another 2 years. 2 years. What could the Japanese have done in 2 years of no American response? By the time the fleet was ready and able to get out there, Japan would have been so dug in, there would have been no removing them. As it is, it's going to cost tens of thousands of American lives to dig the Japanese out of those fortified islands that they had for just a brief time. But if they had had it for 2 years of opportunity without any chance of retaliation, it would be nigh on impossible to take back. So the Japanese failed by not destroying the oil facilities. Sixth, while vessels in the repair docks were attacked, and you can see the Cassin and the Downs in the lower left, the USS Cassin, the USS Downs, which had exploded. They were already in dry dock, and so when they exploded, they can't sink. They're already in dry dock, and the USS Pennsylvania behind them. But you see those repair facilities are able to put not only capital ships, they're going to repair all of the battleships and cruisers that were damaged in the attack. You can see the picture on the right of the USS Nevada entering one of those dry docks where it's going to be repaired and returned to service. You can see a cruiser being repaired. You can see an aircraft carrier being repaired. You can see harbor tugs being repaired at these repair facilities. The fact that they weren't targeted allows the American Navy to repair the damage that the Japanese inflicted in a much shorter amount of time. If the dry docks had been destroyed at Pearl Harbor, the nearest dry dock is Mare Island, California, or Puget Sound, Washington. Those are the two areas in which the Navy would have to go, retreating thousands of miles. But by not destroying those repair facilities, the Navy is able to put ships back into commission in a shorter turnaround time because they don't have to go back to the West Coast. In fact, let me give you an example, which we'll talk about the battle in a later video, but at the Battle of Coral Sea, which stops the Japanese invasion of Australia, the two American aircraft carriers tasked to the Battle of Coral Sea, the USS Yorktown, transferred from the Atlantic Fleet, and the USS Lexington will go into the Battle of Coral Sea. The Lexington will be sunk. The Yorktown will be severely damaged. Limping back to Pearl Harbor, those repair facilities work around the clock to put the Yorktown back into seaworthy condition so that it can then put to sea and be available for the Midway campaign, which is the turning point of the war. That would have been impossible. The United States would have only had 2 aircraft carriers at the Battle of Midway, and it would have changed the course of war. But with the Yorktown and the planes it had available, the United States is going to knock out the cream of the Japanese Navy because those repair facilities are available and working. Number 7, the Japanese, while destroying a lot of aircraft on the ground and immobilizing, destroying a lot of the hangar facilities, they didn't destroy the airfields. Huge crater-making bombs in the middle of airfields make them impossible to use. But because the Japanese didn't really touch the airfields, they're available for aircraft to be ferried over from the United States and be quickly put in a defensive posture. So if the Japanese had followed up with an invasion, it probably would not have been successful because the aircraft would have been there to carry on where the Navy couldn't. So even though the Air Corps suffered a substantial blow, the airfields were still operable. And then finally, as we have seen in our discussions of American public opinion, in fact, on December 6th, 1941, the day before Pearl Harbor, the Gallup organization took an opinion poll, and the American public was 94% against American involvement in the war. Now, they're not against supporting Britain. They're not against supporting the Free French that are in Britain. They're not against helping the Chinese. They're not against helping the Soviets. But they do not want to go to war. And so by attacking Pearl Harbor, the Japanese did Great Britain the greatest favor they could possibly do by getting the United States and giving the United States a casus belli, a cause of conflict. American public opinion that was 94% against the war on December 6th, on December 8th, was 98% in favor of war. What changed? Well, December 7th, 1941, a date that will live in infamy. The United States rallied around the war and rallied around the war effort. In fact, as Roosevelt went before Congress, he will be authorized, a declaration of war will be passed with only one dissenting vote. And so on December 8th, the United States declares war on Japan. And then on December the 11th, 1941, Germany and Italy did Britain a huge favor. Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. Following the Tripartite Pact, they declare war upon the United States, who had declared war on Japan. Thus, Roosevelt is able to activate the Atlantic Charter, and by agreement between Roosevelt and Churchill, it will be Hitler and Mussolini that will be the primary targets of British and American attacks. And while Japan started U.S. involvement in the war, Japan is going to be relegated to a backdoor effort, a holding action, if you will. Now, the simple fact is that holding action was far more successful than anybody anticipated. But most of the war effort will go to Europe. The Pacific War is a sideshow, not to minimize its importance, but it's a sideshow to the bigger conflict in Europe until it's concluded by the Atlantic Charter. And so Japan, in attacking the United States, enabled the United States to openly now come into the war and defeat Germany, Italy, and then ultimately Japan. Next time we'll look at the European theater of operation. All right.